Have you ever wondered what it would be like to get to just sit down and directly ask God a question? How incredible would that be? To speak to our Creator and find things out directly from Him. Now, I'm sure that's something that virtually every theist has thought of at some point. But for Christians, of course, we don't see this as merely an interesting thought experiment. We believe that at one time, this was a reality. 2,000 years ago, people had the opportunity to directly ask Jesus Christ questions, who, of course, is God in the flesh. And indeed, though not all realized it at the time, there were many people who got the chance on this earth to directly ask God a question. And I think we really ought to take interest in the answers that he gave. I know that for me, that's long been something I've been interested in. And if you take a look online, a lot of other people have had this thought, wanting to figure out how many questions Jesus was asked and how many he directly answered. And if you start looking online, you might find something that shocks you. There is a claim that appears over and over online that Jesus was actually asked 183 questions in the Bible and that he himself actually asked 307. But the most shocking of all, of those 183 questions that he was asked, he only answered 3 of them. I have a few screenshots up here of posts and articles that talk about this claim. Less than 2% of the questions Jesus was asked did he actually give a direct answer. It is such a shocking statistic, in fact, that Martin Copenhaver actually wrote a book in 2014 about this topic called Jesus is the Question. You can see on the cover there, 307 questions Jesus asked and 3 he answered. That is a pretty remarkable finding. But actually, the claim even predates this 2014 book. I found online there were a couple of messages in blogs or forums that are 20 or more years old. This one from a person named Emma, who said Jesus was asked 183 questions, but he only answered 3 directly. And another one, also from 20 years ago, quoted Richard Rohr, a controversial Franciscan priest, who made note of this statistic back in 2002. So this claim is all over the place, and when I first heard it, I was pretty shocked and pretty amazed. But my amazement quickly turned into a bit of skepticism. I realized that the methodology would really make a difference in numbers like these, and it is kind of subjective, determining which questions Jesus directly answered. I also realized that there are probably more than 3 questions that Jesus directly answered, because off the top of my head I could think of a few more than 3. So this statistic seemed like it might be a little bit unreliable. But yet another concern of mine was whether or not this statistic was being used for an agenda. And what I did find is that some people citing this statistic seem to be using it to push certain agendas. Here's a few posts where you can sort of see this, and I don't want to read in too much into the real intentions of these people, but you do kind of get a sense here of a criticism of more organized religion. And there were places where it seemed that the agenda was even a little bit more explicit. In that book by Copenhaver, you can see he says in his overview, contrary to some common assumptions, Jesus is not the ultimate answer man, but more like the great questioner. To me, that does seem like a little bit of a theological statement being made right there. Also, that post by that Emma person that I mentioned that was about 20 years old, you can see in these highlighted portions, she didn't really have the most positive things to say about the church, how the church is an official answering machine, a self-assured program for sin management, as well as the claim that most of Jesus' teachings would not pass contemporary orthodoxy tests in either the Roman Office or the Southern Baptist Convention. In that other post I mentioned, which is quoting Richard Rohr, he said that Jesus' idea of church is not about giving people answers. So this all seems to be very critical of the detailed, complex theology that has developed over the centuries and the millennia. There's the implication that the church has gotten away from how Jesus himself was, and that the extremely low proportion of questions answered to questions asked is a reflection of this. So, recognizing that these statistics might be a bit unreliable, I decided to crack open the good book myself and count up all the questions Jesus was asked, as well as looking at his answers. What I soon realized, though, is that I needed a good methodology, because two people can get vastly different answers to questions like these. There is subjectivity. One example, there are a lot of, obviously, parallel accounts in different Gospels, especially the Synoptics, where they tell the same story about Jesus, sometimes close to word for word. So if the exact same question is being repeated in multiple Gospels, should that count as one question or multiple? For example, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? That is found in both Matthew 11 and Luke 7. Another thing to consider, sometimes two questions are asked of Jesus in one single question statement. This happens quite a few times. For example, in Matthew 18, Peter asks, "If my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive him? As many as 7 times?" You can see there's 2 question marks there, so in one sense it is 2 questions, but it's being packaged into one question statement. So what do we do with that? Do we count it as 1 or 2? And a third thing to consider, Jesus answered some questions that were not actually directed at him. Sometimes he answered questions that other people were asking his disciples, or questions that people had in their own hearts. For example, in John chapter 6, the Jews quarreled among themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" So they have a question, but they don't ask Jesus, yet he gives an answer. So does that count as a question for Jesus? Anyone wishing to take on this task of counting every question needs to have a methodology prepared before going into it. And so what I decided is that multiple questions in one question statement should not be counted separately. They should go together as one question. Likewise, parallels in different Gospels should not be counted separately, and I only looked at specific questions that were actually addressed to Jesus. Didn't look at questions that he answered that were not directed at him. So you might prefer a different methodology, but that's what I ended up going with. And what I found is that the number of questions that Jesus was asked was 90. 88 in the 4 Gospels, and 2 more in Acts of the Apostles. None in the rest of the books of the New Testament. So where is that 183 coming from? Well, what I found is that if you split question statements up, which as I said I didn't do, you would get 26 more. Likewise, if you counted parallels in the different Gospels separately, you would get 35 more. So that would then get us to 151 questions asked of Jesus. So making up the difference then, the 32 more, to get to that 183 figure, it must come from questions that are not directed at Jesus, but answered by him nonetheless, as well as perhaps certain statements made by people that were, in a sense, expecting a reply as if it was a question, but not worded as a question. So for example, the disciples saying, "Lord, teach us how to pray as John taught his disciples." I actually saw that Emma person who I mentioned earlier counted that as a question in her post about it. So I at least now understand where that 183 figure came from, but to me it seems a little bit deceiving, and that 90 is actually more accurate. It doesn't split up question statements, and it doesn't count parallels separately. So I think 90 is a more accurate count. By the way, if you want to see all the questions I counted up, or if you're skeptical of any of my claims, definitely check out my spreadsheet. I put it in the description below. It includes all 90 questions, every response, as well as the verses where you can find them, who asked it, and whether or not I thought Jesus gave a direct answer. But the next question is, how many of those did he answer? Was it really only 3? Well, this is once again not a black and white. There's a spectrum going on here. Some questions Jesus answers very directly, others pretty directly, Others, it's a little ambiguous, but he's definitely giving an answer. And some, he definitely avoids the question entirely. But this is all highly debatable. So what I decided to do is break it down into 4 categories. Directly answered questions by Jesus, indirectly answered questions, questions where his reply didn't really answer the question, and silence, where he said nothing in response to the question. So, knowing that all of these different sources online were saying that Jesus only directly answered 3 questions, how many do you think he actually directly answered in the Gospels and Acts? Pause the video and put your guess down below in the comments. But here we go. The answer is 23 direct answers. Now, as I said, it's highly subjective, highly debatable. I could see this number being as high as 33, actually. I could also see it being as low as 17. But in any case, this is a pretty low percentage out of all the questions he was asked. Only about 20 to 30% or so did he give a completely direct answer. However, this is clearly more direct answers than 3, as all these online sources are saying, or even the 7 or 8 that we saw proposed in a couple of those screenshots earlier in the video. However, Jesus gave a number of indirect answers. Along with the 23 that he directly answered, there were 38 where he gave indirect answers. So still answering the question, and the listener would be able to understand that without a doubt, but just in a little bit more of a roundabout fashion. There were also 23 times where Jesus gave no answer, as in he replied to the question but did not answer it at all in his response. And then there were also 6 times where there is no recorded response by Jesus. So, interestingly, over 2/3 of questions posed to Jesus were answered by him, either directly or indirectly. So it is really ridiculous to put that 3 number out there as if Jesus almost never answered questions. Most of the time, he did offer an answer that sufficiently responds to and addresses the question at hand. Now that we've addressed that misconception, let's look at a couple of statistics that I observed in counting up all of these questions asked of Jesus. Firstly, who asked them? Well, 41, so almost half, were asked by disciples, like Peter, Paul, John the Baptist, and just the disciples in general. 17 were asked by the religious leaders, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the high priest. 13 were asked by, as John calls them, the Jews, crowds who had gathered around Jesus, but weren't necessarily his close followers. In some contexts, though, this might be referring to religious leaders as well. There were also 7 questions asked of Jesus by Pontius Pilate, 1 asked by the Virgin Mary, of course with a 12-year-old Jesus in the temple. 2 were asked by demons, or more specifically, demon-possessed people. And 9 were asked by people in the other category. So these were people he healed, the unrepentant thief, the rich young man, the Samaritan woman, etc. Also, what about the different Gospels? Which Gospels was Jesus asked the most questions in? Actually, it was the Gospel of John, with 41 questions asked of Jesus. 33 in Matthew, 24 in Mark, and only 23 in Luke. Even though it's the longest gospel in word count, it had the least questions. But if you count Acts, Acts has 2 more, so then that would be 25 in Luke Acts. And some other things I observed. So of the 29 non-answers that Jesus gave, either not answering the question or remaining silent, only 11 of them were directed at his disciples and their questions. And out of those 11, many of them have caveats. For example, 3 times the disciples were asking Jesus, where can we get enough loaves to feed the crowd? Not exactly a profound question. So what we can see from that is that Jesus rarely left his own disciples in the dark. Almost all the time, if his disciples had a question, he offered a good answer in response. I also found that Jesus was asked about 1.4 questions per chapter in the four Gospels. The vast majority of questions asked were during his ministry, but before the Passion started. 20 questions were asked of him from the time of the Last Supper up to the time of his condemnation by Pilate. 4 questions were asked of Jesus after the resurrection, 1 in John, 1 in Luke, and 2 in Acts. And 1 was asked when Jesus was a child. And one other interesting thing I found, 17 were what questions, 12 were who questions, 8 were where questions, only 2 were when questions, 9 were why, 10 how, 7 do, and 11 are, as well as several questions that didn't actually have an interrogative word. So we can clearly see from these numbers and from looking at that spreadsheet that Jesus wasn't completely indirect all the time. But there were still quite a few times where Jesus was rather indirect with his answers. And why is that? Did Jesus really not care about religious truth claims or having all the answers? I don't think that's really what this is about. When we look at the 29 times where Jesus didn't give any answer at all, we need to understand these instances with a bit more context. Sometimes, when Jesus didn't truly answer the question, it was because in his response he was addressing something that had been said by the questioner after the question. So, for example, in John chapter 6, verse 68, Peter says, "Master, to whom shall we go? You have the words of everlasting life. We know and have come to believe that you are the Messiah." Now, already that's not really a question looking for an answer, saying, "To whom shall we go?" But in Jesus' response, he responds to what Peter says after, when he, speaking for the 12 disciples, says that we have come to believe. And Jesus says, "Did I not choose you 12, but is not one of you a devil?" Referring, of course, to Judas. So Jesus is pointing out here that Peter isn't right to speak for all of the disciples, because there is one of them who still does not believe. Similarly, there were some times where Jesus was asked the question, but it wasn't really expecting an answer, like Pilate saying, "What is truth?" The gospel says immediately when he said this, he went out to the crowd, so he wasn't waiting around for an answer. But even when neither of these things were the case, Jesus' less direct answers weren't about avoiding the truth. Of course, there were many times where Jesus gave witty replies and not really a boring direct answer. For example, the "render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God." But one thing that Jesus often did do when he didn't directly answer a question is he reframes the perspective of the person asking the question. For example, Martha saying to Jesus, "Do you not care that my sister has left me alone to do all the work?" Jesus doesn't say, "Yes, I do care," or "No, I don't care." He reframes her perspective by saying, "You are anxious about many things, but only one thing is necessary." Another example in John, where the Jews ask him, "Where is your Father?" Jesus does not say, "My Father is here," or "My Father is there." He says, "You know neither me nor my Father." So that doesn't really seem to be answering the question, right? But what Jesus is doing, again, is reframing perspective. Because, of course, the Father isn't in some physical location. He transcends location and time. And moreover, as Jesus went on to reveal in the Gospel of John, "Anyone who has seen me has seen my Father." So clearly, in his indirect answers, Jesus is not rejecting that there are, of course, ultimate truths. Jesus says that the truth will set you free. By giving indirect answers like these, Jesus is better preparing them to receive the truth with gladness and open arms. Of course, Jesus' example does show us the value of asking questions and being curious. But in that, he is not taking away from the importance of knowing the truth. That's exactly why he founded a church, to be the pillar and foundation of truth, meant to protect his followers from false doctrine and to preserve his words. So a few things we should take away from this. Firstly, don't believe everything you read on the internet. The claim about Jesus answering just 3 questions is repeated constantly by a number of prominent people as well. In fact, on one of those screenshots of tweets that I shared, Wesley Huff, the prominent Protestant apologist, replied to one of them and said that this statistic of Jesus only answering 3 questions was one that he had cited in the past, but no longer did so because he couldn't find good evidence for it. So don't just take people's word for things. Do your due diligence and make sure that it is the truth. Secondly, as I said already, Christianity is indeed about questions. In teaching people, Jesus asked many questions, and he even answered questions that were posed to him sometimes with questions. And I think that's a really effective strategy because it can point to some of the presuppositions and misunderstandings that people have. So we can learn a lot from the way that Jesus used questions. But Christianity is about answers. So just as St. Paul spoke about the importance of having true beliefs, so too with us Christians in the 21st century. The questions are important, but so are the answers. Another takeaway from some of Jesus' question habits: to ask good questions. There's that saying, there's no such thing as a dumb question, but I think we all know that's not really true. There can be dumb questions. And so I think we should be thoughtful about our questions, because as Jesus pointed out through his actions, some of the questions that he was asked were not good ones. And so he had to reframe the perspective of the person who was asking it. And so I definitely encourage you to check out that spreadsheet, look at the different ways that Jesus answers questions, and come up with your own takeaways. The words of Jesus truly are the words of God, and so we should want to read and reflect on them every day. Finally, I'll leave you with a quote by Saint Boniface. The church is like a great ship being pounded by the waves of life's different stresses. Our duty is not to abandon ship, but to keep her on her course. I think we need to be reminded that anyone who follows Christ should love the church. We should stand by it and want to see it doing great work as the kingdom of heaven on earth. Remember that Jesus said, "The kingdom is like a mustard seed that grows from the smallest of all seeds to become a place where even the birds can dwell." That is the church. It has grown exponentially since it was 120 people in the upper room in Jerusalem. So we should expect that over time it has clarified things and developed a better way to articulate the truth. We shouldn't expect the church to look the same way that it did 2,000 years ago. And we shouldn't expect it to leave the faithful to the wolves on issues as they arise, like the Arian controversy, mandatory circumcision or not, which books belong in the Bible, and on and on. As believers, we trust that the church is not an earthly answer machine, but that it is guided by the Spirit of truth and protected from the gates of hell. We ought to submit to it. Now, once again, questions can be beneficial, as Jesus clearly showed. So each of us, as representatives for the church and members of it, should use questions the same way Jesus did, to glorify God by getting people refocused and recommitted to the gospel. So let us find a balance between questions and answers. Each one of us can use questions to point people to Christ, and we trust in the church's ability to guide the faithful, giving them answers and helping them to seek God. We must never cease to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, because he is the true answer. God bless.